everyone. Welcome on this beautiful spring day. We're delighted to have you all here, especially because it's so nice out. You could be doing other things. Erickson's is open, there's yard work to do, but here you are, so thank you for that. This is our 10th Maynard Book Festival, and we have enjoyed excellent crowds at all of our events. It's been a wonderful experience. First off, we want to thank the Friends of the Library and the Maynard Cultural District for supporting the festival. If you're interested, inspired perhaps to join Friends, there are, as Allie is holding up, there's a QR code that will take you right to our Join the Friends page. So you can find those at the back there. Also want to thank Silver Unicorn for being here for selling books. Silver Unicorn's a wonderful bookstore and a wonderful support for authors and the entire community. We had a number of festival volunteers, people that worked all year to organize this, and people that have been here all week since Thursday. I mean, not all since Thursday, but well, some of us feel that way. But we want to thank those people. A lot of hard work, a lot of talents, a lot of excellent baking. Just as we were organizing the festival and thinking, we really need something on the walls, we got an email that said, I have a fiber art exhibit about stories. Would that be of interest? Yes, come on down. So Cindy Kennelly did all of these works. We have a children's corner that she inspired. So I encourage you to check out all of the artwork. Okay. This is the second to last program. I was going to say penultimate, but that's just kind of fancy. Second to last program in the festival. Jenna Blum will be here tonight. She is incredibly entertaining. And her book is really hard to describe. It's a thriller. It's a mystery. It's romance, twisted romance, and it is hilarious. So that's at 7:00. So if you want to come on back for that, we hope you can join us. And we have a couple more programs coming up this spring. There are flyers back on the table where you can join the Friends. We're celebrating the U.S. 250th, and the library's 20th anniversary in this building is coming up this summer. So we hope you'll all come back and celebrate that with us. We're planning a party. Okay, let's get started. You've probably heard enough of me talking. We have three wonderful authors with us tonight. I'm going to introduce you. Well, my pages are in the wrong order. Let's start with Elizabeth Graver. She's the author of 5 novels. Her latest, Kantika, was awarded the Edward Lewis Wallant Award, the Julia Ward Howe Award, Massachusetts Book Award for Fiction, and the National Jewish Book Award. It was named Best Historical Fiction Book of 2023 and a notable Book of the Year by the New York Times. Elizabeth's 4th novel, The End of the Point, was longlisted for the 2013 National Book Award in Fiction. Her other books are Awake, The Honey Thief, Unraveling, and Have You Seen Me? So welcome, Elizabeth. Juliette Fay, in the center here, is an award-winning bestseller author of historical and contemporary fiction. Her books have been recognized by the Massachusetts Center for the Book, Indie Next List, Library Journal as a top 5 best books of the year, and by the American Library Association as a shortlist for the Women's Fiction Award. Her books include Shelter Me, The Shortest Way Home, Tumbling Turner Sisters, City of Flickering Light. Do you remember which book you came to talk about at the library?
I think it was the Tumbling Turner Sisters.
Yeah, I think that's right. City of Lights. City of Flickering Light. Wait, what? Okay.
Thank you.
And Catches When We Fall. Her 8th novel, The Harvey Girls, was published in 2025, and Library Journal said about it that Juliette Fay is known for well-drawn characters and vibrant historical backdrops. All right. And finally, we have Sarah Stewart Taylor visiting from Vermont today. We're vibrating. Is it this? Is that better? That's better. Okay, good. We've had trouble with sound all day. Sarah Stewart Taylor is the author of the Sweeney St. George series set in New England, the Maggie Darcy mysteries set in Ireland and on Long Island, and Agony Hill and Hunter's Heart Ridge, which series needs needs a title, It needs a name. And that is set in rural Vermont in the 1960s. Sarah's been nominated for an Agatha Award, Dashiell Hammett Prize, Mystery Writers of America Sue Grafton Memorial Award, and her mysteries have appeared on numerous Best of the Year lists. So welcome to you all. We're thrilled to have you here. And my next thing said, please welcome. Okay. So let's get started with throwing pens around. Let's get started. Why don't you each do an introduction about your book? And if it makes sense to do a short passage while you're doing the introduction, go ahead. So why don't we start with you, Elizabeth?
Okay. Thank you so much for having us. I love libraries, I love book festivals, and I live nearby in Lincoln, so I come to your movie theater here a lot. I love it. It's so great. So this book, Kantika, I'll just give you a super brief introduction. I'll tell you first about the title. My copy's a little marked up because it's my battered copy that I read from with my notes in it. But the story was inspired by my grandmother's migration story. I've written several other historical novels that are not connected to my family history, and this is the first one that is so directly connected. But decades ago, when I was 21, I interviewed my grandmother telling me stories about her life, and I was always very interested by her and a bit perplexed by her. I knew she'd been born in Turkey, but she was sort of Spanish, and she spoke this language over my head that I didn't really understand. She was Jewish, but she was very different from my other Jewish relatives on my father's side who were Ashkenazi Jewish. So basically, she was Sephardic Jewish, which means that she was part of a group of people who were expelled from Spain during the Spanish Inquisition and were welcomed in the Ottoman Empire. So my family had lived in Turkey for hundreds and hundreds of years until the 1930s, 20s, when, for complicated reasons that are in the book, they left. And they moved very weirdly to Spain, which was not a place where Jews really moved, or even now it has a tiny Jewish population because they'd been expelled, right? But there was this brief moment when there was a law welcoming them back, and for a variety of reasons they ended up there, and then eventually she ended up in the United States by way of Cuba, and my mother was born in Queens, New York, a little bit after her mother had come, and I knew that my grandmother had a blended family, had lost her first husband, had a very complicated and rich, interesting past. So long story short, I interviewed her, sat around with these. She died a few years later. We were always really close, and she was a real storyteller, but I also found she was a very joyful person, and I often kind of sensed that there was sorrow and tumult in her past as well, and that bore out in the tapes. But so fairly recently, this book took me almost a decade to write, I decided to try to tell this story, and I was drawn partly to it by the times and the fact that a lot was happening in the U.S. when I started the book around immigration, and I teach at Boston College, and I was teaching a lot of first-generation students, and I was noticing kids being taken away at the borders, and I was also learning more about Jewish history and was very interested in how this Sephardic story is not told. There's just not that many books about it. And I was also interested in the fact that my mother and my uncles were aging, and that I wanted both to get as much as I could from them in terms of the stories and also give them the gift of this book. So it took me a long time. It's a weird novel in that it's fiction, but it has photographs and a lot of real names, so it's rather hybrid. And the title, Kantika, means song in Judeo-Spanish or Ladino, which is the language that my family spoke at home. It was my mother's first language. It's a kind of mix of pre-expulsion Spanish and Hebrew and other contact, French, Turkish. It's an incredibly interesting language. So do you want me to read a little now, or should I wait?
Yeah.
Should I just read a paragraph?
Yeah,
All
read
right.
a little bit.
So the book covers 4 countries, and it follows Rebecca, my grandmother, and I used her real name. I couldn't get her permission, but we all in my family agree, because she's not alive, sadly, but that she was someone who sort of always felt that her story was important, and never got a chance to really share it. So everybody, it's very tricky to write about real people, and I was nervous about it, but everybody in my family has embraced this story, and everyone's like, Grandma would be thrilled, even though I was very careful not to just idealize her. Like, was a person, as we all are, with flaws, and you see that in the book. All right, so I'm just going to read you the first paragraph, which you'll see. Basically, I started where I did partly because I wanted to really bring the reader in to this very vivid world, but also because so much changes. So you'll see here she was born into a very privileged background, unlike my grandfather, who was also from Turkey and was very poor, and also a very cosmopolitan and what we now would call multicultural background, even as her Judaism was central to who she was. So I'll just read you a little bit. There's a photo that if you want, well, you can, Silver Unicorn has the book, but also on my website, elizabethgraver.com, I have all these photos. She was a very, very, very cute little girl, round-faced and solemn, with big bows in her hair. So this starts in Istanbul, but they called it Constantinople in her community at that time, in 1907. This, the beautiful time, the time of wingspans, leaps, and open doors, of the heedless, headlong flow from here to there. This, the time before thought, the world arriving not as lists or hearkening back or future tense, but as breath-filled music, cantar, sing. Rebecca sings to the rhythm of the oars as the boat delivers her to school, and in school with the nuns. Interestingly, she went to Catholic school. Tournez vos yeux vers Jésus, and climbing ropes at Maccabee gymnastics, hand over hands, and wrap your feet, girls. But what draws her up is less the instructor barking commands or the strength of her limbs than the unspooling thread of her own voice. In wordless tunes, nonsense sounds, ballads, in Ladino, French, bits of Turkish, Hebrew, Greek, she sings. As on the street, the lemon man sings lemons, the Bulgarian sings pudding, the vegetable man sings eggplant, squash, and artichokes. Fresh, cheap ladies, how I wait for you with my aubergine. She sings at school in chorus and for daily hymns, and at night her mother sings the children to sleep. Duerme, duerme, querido Hijico. Sleep, sleep, darling boy, though two of them are girls. And if the dull-eyed nightingale rarely makes a chirp, still her father stops by its cage most mornings to try to coax it into song, and he sings at synagogue, "You have given me a throat that has not gone dry for calling out to you." And one strange morning after services, he leads Rebecca to the ark. She has just turned 8, still more baby than girl in his eyes, and she sings to the men below and the women above. Her voice is unwavering as the cushioned freedoms and unspeakable good fortune of her childhood. Still, her grandmother sews a blue banjuk bead to the underside of every collar to ward off the evil eye. I'll stop there.
So my book is The Harvey Girls, and The Harvey... So sorry, I need to use this, right? This thing that's in my hand. The Harvey Girls were waitresses in the Southwest. Fred Harvey was the man who figured out that people... Is it? That people actually wanted to have good food as they traveled across the country in the late 1800s. So he set up restaurants along the railroad throughout the Southwest. So it was really a Southwestern phenomenon. I found out about it while I was researching my previous book, City of Flickering Light, which apparently I was here for, which is about people trying to make it in the silent movie industry, and they hop on a train to try and make it to Hollywood. And I thought, well, how would they eat? And I found out about the Harvey houses. So waitresses came from all over the country. About half of them came from the Southwest, from the Midwest, farm girls. And what was really interesting to me about the Fred Harvey Company and how he treated these young women, they came and they lived in dorms. They were paid actually rather well for the time. He opened his first restaurant in 1876. They would send the money home. And they became important breadwinners in their families. Sometimes they were making more than their fathers and brothers because they got, free room and board, and they made tips, and they also got a salary. They also had this opportunity for adventure that most women in the late 1800s and early 1900s did not have. You couldn't travel alone. You needed a chaperone or a husband or that kind of thing. It was also really hard for women to make it on their own because the jobs that they were offered were low paying. So you really needed a husband. Being a spinster was not a good gig. But Harvey girls, because they made money and because they had this sense of going someplace far away, which most young girls in that time, you went maybe the next town over and hoped to marry a nice guy. They had this sense of adventure. He set it up so that every 6 months they got a vacation. They could take a week off. They could ride anywhere in the Southwest on the Santa Fe Railroad for free, stay at other Harvey girl dorms, stay and eat for free. So they had this ability to have agency over their lives that was very rare for that time. And financial security. One of the things I love of the many little minutiae I learned about Harvey girls is that they tended to marry later than their other girls their age because they had their own money. They didn't need to just marry the first guy that came along. They liked their freedom. And because the Southwest was mostly men, it was 2/3 men, ranchers, prospectors, cattle guys, that kind of thing. And in fact, there was a great saying, there are no ladies west of Dodge City, Kansas, and there are no women west of Albuquerque. So suddenly, Fred Harvey owns all these restaurants. He brings these women into the Southwest. Approximately 100,000 women became Harvey girls from 1876 to the 1960s when the company folded. About 50% of them chose to stay in the Southwest. Many of them married. Many of them had boys, thousands of boys named either Fred or Harvey, because they were proud of how they'd gotten there and what they did. And Fred Harvey is actually credited with populating the Southwest because he brought in women. So as soon as I found out, and I waitressed throughout my 20s, so I was like, as soon as I found out about this phenomenon, which most people haven't heard about it in the East, unless you have watched the 1946 musical by the same name, The Harvey Girls, with Judy Garland, which Harvey girls at the time said didn't really, represent their experience. They worked much harder, and there was much less singing and dancing. But it was very fun for them to have their experience, go all over the world with none other than Judy Garland. So I've been, all over the country, doing book tour, and it's really interesting to say to any audience, like, how many people have heard of the Harvey Girls? Anybody? Oh, couple. Nice. So I'm just going to I'll do a quick, the book features two main characters who were not real people, but I became, in doing all the research and listening to, reading biographies and interviews with former Harvey girls, two kinds of girls. One were the girls who were running from something. Poverty, abuse. Many Harvey girls were orphans. And the others were, the other group that I became sort of interested in were the ones that were lying to get a job. You had to be 18, and I learned of girls as young as 14, because it was such a good gig, saying they were 18 and leaving their moms and their, whatever situation they were in, and traveling across the country to become waitresses in the Southwest. I'm just going to read, I'm going to keep it short, and I'm just going to read you about the first character, Charlotte. Charlotte felt the woman's scrutiny like heat from a flame too close to her skin. She forced herself not to flinch away from it. Flinching, she'd learned, only invited more trouble. "And you've never waitressed before?" Miss Steele said lightly, as if to counterpoint the obvious fact that she was making far more important assessments. "No, I worked in a milliner's shop, and I served people, but not food." "A hat shop. Even now, it was hard to believe. That was not the life he'd described, the life he'd promised. But becoming a shop girl was the least of it. Promises had fallen like autumn leaves on the Boston Common, hadn't they? That's just fine. We prefer girls without prior experience. They tend to have fewer bad habits to correct. Bad habits? Charlotte was certain that if she'd had any, which she doubted, they'd been trained out of her at the highly esteemed Windsor School for Girls. A sound mind and a sound body was their motto, and she'd taken it very much to heart, until lately. Like serving a beverage without a tray, or wearing an apron with a spot on it, Miss Steele explained. Or smiling a little too long at a customer. Flirting? Exactly. I don't flirt. This seemed important to say. In the last 2 years, Charlotte had become a keen observer of what to say, and more crucially, what not to say at any given moment. I'm glad to hear that. Miss Steele studied her face, particularly her right eye. She glanced down at Charlotte's left hand, the one that had, until an hour ago, worn a gold band. You're not married? No. Sometimes you had to fib. That was important, too. Charlotte fought the urge to touch the tender skin under her eye. She had waited a week for the swelling to go down and the car tire black to fade to jaundice yellow. And there's nothing keeping you from traveling far from home? Oh, no, not at all. Charlotte almost laughed. Quite the opposite. Miss Steele pursed her lips and looked out the window. The office was on the second floor of Union Station in Kansas City, Missouri, and a cold March rain speckled the panes, obscuring the train yard and the city below. Charlotte curled her toes into her best black patent leather pumps with the champagne-colored bows. Well, the bows were gone now. One had come off, and she couldn't go around with one bow, so she'd torn the other from its spot and tucked it away. For what purpose, she couldn't say. A reminder of better times, perhaps, or the abysmal depth of her own stubborn foolishness. The woman leveled a meaningful gaze. I feel I must ask about your eye. You seem to have received a blow of some kind. Sometimes you had to tell the truth, which Miss Steele seemed to intuit anyway. Yes, said Charlotte, and if you give me a job, the bruise will fade. If you don't, it will simply be renewed.
Great. Well, it's so great to see you all here, and it's really fun to be down here from Vermont. And I just noticed as I was looking up at the screen that I'm wearing the exact same shirt I was wearing in my author photo. So I want to assure you that I do have other shirts. I do have other shirts. I guess I just like this one. I don't know. It's a good shirt. So I write. I've written 3 crime fiction series. My first series is sort of set. Actually, some of the books are not too far from here. It's sort of a Boston, Cambridge set series about a young art history professor who specializes in the art of death, funerary art. And one of the books is actually set in Concord, where she solves a mystery sort of by knowing a lot about the art on Revolutionary War era gravestones. So I always enjoy being back in this region. I spent some happy years a long time ago researching that book here. And then I have written a series set in Ireland as well. But my new series is set in Vermont, very close to where I live, in the Upper Valley of New Hampshire and Vermont. And the inspiration for the series, I have to sort of go back a little bit and talk about. I was a journalist at our daily newspaper in our area, and I was assigned a story about the anniversary of a really tragic, terrible death that happened in our area. And that was the death of a man named Romain Tenney in a town called Wethersfield, Vermont. And he actually committed suicide the night before the federal government came to take his farm to build Interstate 91. He had been protesting. He had been trying to get them to move the interstate somewhere else. He had a farm that his family had worked for generations. And he was kind of was kind of an unusual character. He, even though it was 1964 when he died, he still used a horse and cart rather than a tractor, and he lived alone in this old farmhouse. And he saw the coming of the interstates as kind of the end of an era, the end of his way of life, and so he killed himself and burned his farm the night before the bulldozers were coming. And as a reporter, I interviewed some of his family and some of the people from town who had known him, and I was just really just fascinated by this period in American history, Vermont history, where these two interstates were sort of slowly creeping towards my region. 91, of course, was coming up the Connecticut River through Massachusetts, and 89 was coming from Massachusetts up through New Hampshire. And the plan was for them to cross in White River Junction, Vermont, which was an old railroad town. And a lot of the people who lived in our area were excited about this. They thought this will be business and opportunity, and it'll be, a shorter trip to Boston. But a lot of people were really anxious about the crime that would arrive in Vermont on the interstates and how it would change our way of life. And I felt like this period was really sort of an interesting one to explore. And of course, there are other things going on: the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement. Women are trying to gain new rights, and in some cases succeeding. And so it was just this really interesting period of history. So the Hunter's Heart Ridge is the second book in the series. The first one, Agony Hill, opens with a young cop moving to Vermont from Boston to take a job with the Vermont State Police. And he's sort of barely arrived when he gets called up to a suspicious barn fire. And as he starts looking into it, he has a lot of questions about the farmer's family and his neighbors. And he also has a lot of questions about his next-door neighbor, who is, as she describes herself, a woman of a certain age who has sort of a past in intelligence gathering. Her husband was an OSS and then CIA officer. And so she has this sort of background as a spy, and they become close, and she's very interested in the mysteries he gets involved in. So in the second book, I'm just going to read a very short section at the beginning of the book. His name is Franklin Warren, the young cop, and he's at the general store in his new hometown of Bethany, Vermont, when he gets called to a suspicious shooting on the first weekend of, or the second weekend of Vermont's regular deer hunting season. So let me get my glasses. Okay, chapter 1. Most Sundays, Collar's store on the Green in Bethany, Vermont, was nearly deserted at 10:30 in the morning. The townspeople who were up and about at that hour were headed to church and didn't stop in for their papers and necessities until they had worshipped at their chosen venue, socialized for the requisite hour, and then determined it was time to be on the way. Though it was the day of rest, most residents of Bethany would have too much to do to lounge around all afternoon. Some would go home to farm chores, some to kitchen duty, preparing Sunday dinner. Shopkeepers like the Collar family would spend Sunday evening with the accounting and inventory books, getting ready for the week. But at 10:30 in the morning on the second Sunday of Vermont's regular deer hunting season, Collar's was very busy and decidedly more colorful than usual, thought Vermont State Police Detective Franklin Warren. Standing around in small groups outside and purchasing beef jerky and donuts inside were an endless stream of men in red and black, or bright green and black, checked hunting jackets, rifles stowed in their trucks. One street over from the Green, at Tyler's Texaco, the Fish and Game Department had set up a checking station to weigh and catalog the harvested deer. Those who had been successful that morning, or the day before, drove up in their trucks and unloaded the tagged deer, then loaded them back up again when they were done. While they waited, the lucky hunters told stories and exchanged vital statistics. There was a general air of festivity and good-natured ribbing and boasting. Just a week ago, Warren had celebrated opening weekend of hunting season by joining a group of men from his new home at a deer camp about an hour out of town. The deer camp had been in the family of David Williamson for 3 generations now, and Williamson, the premier lawyer, one of 4 in Bethany, had invited Warren along as soon as he heard he had some hunting experience. Warren had taken it as a gesture of goodwill toward a newly arrived resident, and perhaps also as a means of getting in with the new state police detective stationed in town. And I'll just leave off there. But he gets his necessities at the store, gets home, and then hears about this suspicious shooting at a very elite hunting club in a neighboring town. And things get murkier from there. So I'll leave off.
So I'm rearranging my questions as we go. You answered my second question, all of you. So you all write in historical fiction. What does that genre allow you to explore that writing in contemporary fiction or some other genre doesn't let you get at as well?
So I'm not sure if I'm the only one who does contemporary and historical. Okay. So I don't know if you guys would feel the same, but I think for me what I love in historical fiction is finding some little pocket of history that seems to have been forgotten and learning everything there is that I can get my hands on about it, learning way more than I need for the book, walking around, sort of like a Fred Harvey, what would you like to know about Fred Harvey? I can go on for days. And sort of connecting with that material and then creating characters that will give that sense of history, but also really not feel like a history book, not feel like, there have been nonfiction books written about Fred Harvey and the Harvey girls, but being able to sort of tell a story based on it, and the learning, I would say.
Very similar, actually. I mean, I think we probably all have that research bug. And for me, research is, and maybe this is true for the two of you too, it's both reading, but it's also talking to people, and it's also going places. So to write Kantika, I actually went to Turkey, Spain, and Cuba. So I have sort of these extraordinary adventures. And, I think people sometimes think writers are just sitting alone in their room. But so learning, and I have other novels. I have one set in the Lowell textile mills. I have another one that I think is for sale over there, set in on the south coast of Massachusetts in South Dartmouth. But for each of them, similarly, I'm really interested in kind of the untold stories of history, but I also, just as someone inside the process, love to learn, and I love the language. I'm, as you could probably tell, a pretty languagey writer. I love the voice and the poetry and the stuff of the past. I live in a really old house. I love old stuff because it's so resonant and it speaks. And I'm also very interested in kind of how in learning history, we can understand where we are now. And so I feel like as a writer, so this book is about migration, and it's about how do we live together? How do we fail to? It's about so many things that are such live, incredibly difficult topics right now, and that somehow, for me personally, but also I think in the story I'm telling, there's something about going back to another time that's a kind of oblique but really powerful way to kind of understand cycles. So that's sort of almost more ethical or moral or something, but in terms of just the process, I love to travel, I love to learn, and I love to learn about kind of stuff. So when it was the Lowell Textile Mills, I spent a lot of time in that museum, and I love to talk to people, and so I also think historical fiction allows you, depending on how far back you are, to have really interesting conversations, often with people that no one have ever asked before about whatever it is you're asking, because it's not big history. These are not famous people. These are people living quiet, intricate lives.
Yeah, I love that sense of like the patterns and the history coming back and like sort of having to relearn the lessons of history. And I know one of the things that I really wanted to explore in my series was sort of the generational tension over Vietnam and over protest, and how families grappled with sort of just this idea of like when do I stand up? When do I stand up? For people, for families that had people serving in the military, what was the tension there? And so it was like exploring that within the context of this very small rural Vermont town was really interesting to me. And I had some amazing conversations with people in my family and neighbors. And I also think that I've noticed that whenever I've picked a historical period to write about, there's always sort of a personal connection to. I mean, obviously, Elizabeth, you have a very personal connection to the subject of your novel. But I always find, too, that there's just like, sometimes I don't know it right away, but there's a way in which I choose a historical period to understand myself a little bit better. And I think I realized at some point that this period of the mid-1960s was like right before I was born. And I was really interested in the sense of like, what did the world, like how did the world get to be the world that existed when I was born? And what were my parents experiencing? And so, yeah, it's a way to understand yourself, I think, sometimes.
That's great. So it sounds like you all really enjoy research. Did you have any surprises or any really interesting rabbit holes that you went down? I think, Juliette, I've heard you interviewed where you found out an aspect of the Southwest that you felt like, oh gosh, I have to address this. This is...
So the girls are trained in Topeka. That's where they all mostly got their training. And then they're set out on the line. And I decided that I would send my girls to the Grand Canyon. There was a Fred Harvey, El Tovar, it's still there, built by the Fred Harvey Company, and that I would send them there. And that was because my sister lived in Flagstaff. It was an easy place for me to, land, see my sister, and go do research. So I was all set with that. And then one of the things I learned in my research is that when the Grand Canyon became a forest reserve in 1893 and then a national park in 1919, it really wrought havoc for the Native American tribes that lived there. They were basically cleared out so that white tourists wouldn't have to see them. And it was where they hunted and farmed and did, it had incredible impact on them and generational harm. And so it really gave me pause because I thought, this was happening in the 1920s. I can't not talk about it, but how do I talk about it? And how do I talk about it in the context of the story that I'm trying to tell about waitresses? So that was a little bit of a thorny issue for me in the beginning of how do I talk about this without letting it take over the story, but also by giving it its due because it was really pretty interesting. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for reminding me about that.
So I think something that really surprised me as I was doing my research on this time period was sort of the Cold War history of Vermont. Vermont is not a place that you think of as sort of being, on the front lines of the Cold War. And yet we had some very interesting history associated with that period in our nation's, sort of ramping up of nuclear weaponry and, in particular, intelligence gathering. So, as I started to talk to people, I heard a lot of stories about spies, ex-spies, retiring to Vermont. And if you think about it, it's a great place to kind of disappear, right? You can live on a back road, and you don't have to tell your neighbors to the sort of famous Yankee Reserve. You don't have to tell your neighbors too much about what you were doing before you came to Vermont, and I heard a lot of stories, and so that's sort of where the spy character came from in the book. And then, there just were all these really interesting things. There were missiles sighted in northern Vermont that there was I forget the year now, but there was a period where they became very close to being activated, and there was a whole sort of nuclear panic. And there was just a lot more going on. I mean, I think it makes sense on the Canadian border, but there's just a lot more going on than I would have expected in our quiet state.
So I have so many stories of incredible moments, but I'll share one that actually, Juliette, when you were saying, I resonate with what you said about you found out something that then threatened to take over the book. So I was trying to research what it would have been like to be in Barcelona in the 1920s as a Turkish Jewish immigrant family, and looking at that moment for sort of general stuff, not for my particular family, because I had some things. I had an uncle my Uncle David, who's a character in the book, who sadly died before it came out, but we were super close, and he lived a long life and helped me with the book, died in his late 90s. So he told me stories. He was a little boy in Spain. He was born there, moved to the U.S. when he was 8. But I was going along, kind of reading, looking at archives and looking at old film stuff, and there's a place called the Jewish Film Archive in Waltham, and I saw that there was a 13-minute film called Jews of the Spanish Homeland. So I was like, what's this? So I found it. I think it was a CD that they had to send me, and I'm watching it, and it's this very, very weird kind of avant-garde film. It starts with this man with like wacky-shaped glasses, and the camera's bumping, and you can't quite tell, is it avant-garde or is it just that movies were so new that like the technology is really bad? And he's going along, and he's sort of saying in this somewhat creepy anthropological tone, like, here are the little almond paste makers in Seville, and here's the rabbi in the Balkans. And there was something in the tone that set me off, and I couldn't quite figure out what it was. And then he says, it cuts to Barcelona, and it says, there's even a Jewish family in Barcelona. And it shows suddenly these people standing in a garden, 2 little boys and a woman and an old man and another woman. And I paused, and I was like, I think that's my grandmother. And I think that's my Uncle David at 2 years old. And his little brother, Albert, who was notable, my grandmother always used to say, he looked like baby Jesus, because he had like a big halo of blonde hair, which was unusual for a little Spanish Jewish kid. But so then there was this kid with like this big halo of blonde hair. So I sent the CD to my Uncle David, who called me and was like, holy cow, like what, and who got to, it was them, unnamed in the film. And he got to see himself walking across a screen at age 2 and see his grandparents, who after he left Spain, he never saw again. If you read the novel, you'll see, but there were a lot of very difficult things about how the family was separated and the various wars that then kept them apart. But then I started digging deeper, and this is where I kind of got into, like, what am I going to do with this? Because my feeling that the film was a little creepy, the filmmaker actually turned out to totally turn against that community and become a fascist, and he was exiled to Venezuela, and, like, there's this whole story. And he had started as this kind of arty, avant-garde guy, but he was basically in the palm of whoever he thought was in power. So when he thought that Franco was going to be in power, he would do what he wanted. When he thought that so he just turned. He was a really creepy man. So then I wrote a scene where he shows up at the house, and I was very tempted to kind of keep following this guy because I was fascinated by him, his sort of mix of propaganda and art and having been in the presence of my family. And I remember handing in the book, and my editor said, his name was Jimenez Caballero, she's like, you got to cut him down. Like, he's taking up too much space. It has to be sort of, how did he impact Alberto, based on my great-grandfather, in that very moment, but he can't have this much airtime. So that was difficult, because I was actually really interested in history, and he was very important in wider ways to kind of what was happening to that community at the time and how art can be propaganda and all sorts of things. But I cut down the scene, kept bringing it closer to the Alberto character. And my editor was great. She said, we're not going to get rid of it. Like, fascinating. So it was personally really moving, and it was also just a really interesting experience of first being completely excited that my family had been filmed, that they were seen as important enough, that they'd had this encounter, and then as I learned more, being like, get away, get away. Why would you come and kind of turn these people into something that you're going to parade around for nefarious ends? So my own experience as I learned more, and I found a historian, a niche historian, I'm sure you found them too, who actually specialized in this guy. So she knew a lot more than I did.
So I think we have time for one more question from me with maybe short answers. Is there a particular character that you really enjoyed writing about that's maybe not your main character? I enjoyed all of your books, the rich cast of characters and all of their backstories. So do you want to tell a little nugget about one of your favorites?
Sure. Okay. I seem to be going first. So the character of Charlotte, as you may have guessed, is actually raised quite wealthy in Boston, very wealthy, and goes to Wellesley College and falls in love with a lowly college professor, horrors, and runs away with him because her family will not possibly accept that she, and he turns out to be a bad dude, as you could probably also guess. So Charlotte figures that the only way she's going to get away from this guy, she cannot go home again. She figures out, I'm going to go west and become a waitress, and she has no money and all of that. And Charlotte's arc is one of, she has to figure out what, her eyes are open to what life is like on the other side of the apron. She's used to being served. And suddenly she's in the position of serving and being treated the way that she in the past treated others, treated the people that were serving, the servants in her house. She also becomes friendly with several Native Americans and begins to learn about their history of abuse by the American government and how it resonates with her as an abuse victim. And so Charlotte has this sort of arc of awareness and awakening to the plight of others that she would never have been able to experience had she just stayed home and been a good girl and married one of the Cabots or lodges. So that was and sometimes it's rather funny because she's trying to, fit in and she certainly doesn't. So that was a lot of fun for me to write her character.
So I think one of the characters that sort of surprised me, I think, and so this happens with characters where sometimes you have a character who just sort of is supposed to serve a function in the book, and then something happens and they just become much more than that, and they become really interesting to you, and you kind of end up, I think, those characters can sometimes be your favorite characters, even more than your main characters, who are, complicated and flawed and don't always do what you want them to do. And one of those characters for me was Sylvie Weber, who is the wife of the farmer who dies in the first book in the series. And as Warren, the cop, starts sort of investigating this suspicious fire, he's very confused by her. She's kind of an odd person, and he doesn't understand her, and yet he's very, very drawn to her. And so as we get to know Sylvie, we realize that she's a writer, and she sees the world in impressions and words and sensory detail. And she's, probably today we would say that she's neurodiverse in some way. But at this point, she just thinks of herself as a sort of a writer first. and that's how she experiences the world. And as I started to get to know her and give her a background, I decided that she had grown up on a huge dairy farm right on the Canadian border in the far, it's sort of the northeast part of Vermont. That her family was French Canadian, that she had a lot of siblings, they didn't have a lot of money, and she had married this sort of hippie farmer who was a back-to-the-lander as a way of sort of entering a world of books and literature. And then, of course, it goes very wrong. But I just love her, and she has a big role in the second book, and I sort of now see her as one of the main characters in the series.
So I have many characters I grew fond of. When I started this book, I thought that it would just be Rebecca, based on my grandmother's point of view, and it ended up not being that. And one of the ones that I found hardest and most moving and interesting to write is a character inspired by my Aunt Luna. So the last third of the book is set in the United States, in Queens mostly, New York. And my grandmother in real life and in the novel married my grandfather. They were both widowed. They both had children. And my grandfather had a daughter named Luna who had been born prematurely and had pretty severe cerebral palsy. And I grew up quite close to her. She loved to write. She was a kind of extraordinary person. She, in her old age, lived in Florida and wrote all kinds of newspaper articles about disability and the Jewish community and culture. But she also had a very hard life in various ways. And my grandmother Rebecca was both her savior, because when she arrived and Luna was about 5 and couldn't walk, couldn't talk, no one expected that she had any capacity to do those things. Rebecca rolls up her sleeves and is like, yes, she can. I can tell this is a really bright girl. We're going to get her exercises. When there just was not this, there was very little going on at that time in terms of kind of therapies. And she helped her enormously, but they also had tensions throughout their lives that I witnessed, because this was a blended family and for just all kinds of complicated reasons. So I decided fairly late in the process of writing this book that I wanted Luna to be a central character, and it was very important to me that she have a point of view and a voice. I have a couple friends who are disabled writers and who I've talked, one in particular named Kenny Fries, I've talked to at length about, like, how do you write disability and what does it mean to kind of objectify or give. I wanted to embody. I'd actually been interested in disability for a long time, I think partly from having her as an aunt. But I've written another novel called Awake that has this as a theme. But anyway, I did lots of research, and it ended up just being incredibly moving and interesting and hard. She wasn't alive when I was writing it, and again, I was a little like, would she want me to tell this? She'd written little bits of her story, but I found some incredible things around the doctor who had actually treated her at Columbia Presbyterian, and I had some things from my grandmother in the recordings, and it really kind of, I had been stuck with the last third of the book, and I think it animated it, and part of what was so interesting was that Luna and my grandmother were very different on the surface. My grandmother was very beautiful, and she deployed her beauty. She was a dressmaker, and she needed to, because she had a hard life. They were quite poor after she started out rich, but she also was a performer. She loved the stage, and she was also very shrewd, very smart, very psychologically smart. And Luna was very shrewd, very, very bright, and had a body that was very hard to move through the world with, both physically and in terms of people's reactions. So I was really, really interested in how they butted up against each other and fiercely loved each other. And so it was really interesting to kind of move out of Rebecca's point of view. Luna, like at one point, Rebecca says to Luna, I don't understand why you don't have any friends. Just let people see what you're like. You know, you're like a bright, beautiful, lovely girl. Just let them see you. See what you're like underneath. And Luna thinks, you don't leave the house without, like, adjusting your hat and smiling at yourself in the mirror. You know, so she turns, like, they see each other in these really interesting ways that were really interesting for me to kind of call each other to account with this mix of tenderness, but also they could also be pretty harsh.
Thank you. You all picked the characters that I wanted to.
So you didn't even tell us.
So let's open up for questions from the audience. Who has a question? Go ahead.
Do any of you have background in research, or did you come to this as adults?
So no, I did not. And I was really intimidated by it. My first historical fiction, the idea came to me and I was like, but I'm not a historian. And didn't really even pay that much attention in history class. Like, do I get to write this? So I was really intimidated by it at first, but once I started doing the research, I just decided I'm just going to learn as much as I can about vaudeville. That was my first one. And I was like, I got to write about this. I don't know if I can do it, but I'm going to just give it a try. And sort of fell in love with it. So I guess now I am a researcher.
In graduate school, I studied Irish literature and wrote my master's thesis on the Anglo-Irish writer Elizabeth Bowen, and I spent a lot of. You were? Oh my goodness! Oh my goodness! Wow, we have a lot of name things. So I, as part of, and I did my graduate degree in Ireland, and so I spent a lot of time sort of researching her life and her work and her family. So I had that sort of academic preparation, but I feel like writing historical fiction is very different, right? So there's that kind of research. There's like the book research and the archive research, which is really, I love, digging into archives. But for writing fiction, I found there were other things that I needed to do, and one of the favorite things that I did was, and I'll show you. I actually have props, but I did a lot of research in community cookbooks from the 1940s, 50s, and 60s in Vermont. So this is my favorite one. It's called Out of Vermont Kitchens, and it was produced by the Episcopal women's organizations of the Burlington, Vermont, and Rutland, Vermont Episcopal churches. And, you've all probably seen these. Nursery schools would do these, and many churches do these. But the thing that I love about this one is that the women hand wrote their recipes. So hold on, I'm going to put the microphone down so I can really show you. So each woman hand wrote her recipe, and in many cases did little illustrations. And opening this up was a way of opening up my characters. Many of my characters are sort of accomplished home cooks. But you can learn so much about what people were thinking and what their experiences were from looking at these recipes. And one of my favorite examples is that there are a lot of international recipes in this 1948 version of the cookbook. So even though most of these women had probably never left their county in rural Vermont, they were making Chinese recipes. They were making Russian recipes. They were cooking German food, and I just love that idea of these women who were farm wives in many cases, who were kind of looking at the wider world. So that was a really fun way of doing research.
And this is such a good question. I also went to grad school, and I'm an English professor, so I teach students how to use like the MLA, whatever. I have basic research stuff that I do through my professor-teacher role, but interestingly, I actually think the pieces of the research that I've done for my books that in some ways are the most surprising and interesting stem from the real live conversations. And like Sarah, I was a reporter early on, so I worked for the Berkshire Eagle in college, and I worked for the Hartford Courant. I worked for remember the Boston Phoenix? I wrote freelance for the Boston Phoenix for a while, and I was also a bit of a shy person. You might not know it now. Teaching just beats it out of you. But I there was something about being a reporter that I loved asking questions and being in that role of like your role is to ask questions. What I didn't like about being a reporter is that there were word counts and voice expectations, and they would tell me what the story I should be looking for was. So I remember they'd be like, go write about this carnival, and I'd meet like the woman behind the scenes with the dog, and I would just totally want to go off into the side stories. And you can't do that when you have a deadline and a word count and a voice. So, but something about, I do think that was really good training for partly just getting more confident and realizing that, like, people like to talk, and the unlikely people like to talk. Like, I wrote one of my novels called The Honey Thief. I was interested in bees and this kind of varroa mite that had been making hive collapse, and I was living in Somerville, and I met a old guy named Kenny who had a hive on his porch near Union Square and started chatting, and turns out Kenny was like a masterful teacher. He'd never been a teacher, but he was a really good beekeeper, and he totally knew what I wanted. And so I became pals with him and would go with him in his pickup truck to Billerica and to his other hives. So that sort of thing, I think, in some way, and actually interviewing my grandmother, the reason I did that was because I was so psyched when I was 21 that I had a little cassette recorder with mini cassettes that I had from my internship at the Berkshire Eagle. So I think it wasn't like anyone was formally training me to do oral histories. I would be interested in learning more about the formal way, but I actually love my own method, and I love it when I'm looking for stuff for a novel, because you actually can go down those paths. It's your own thing that you're making. No one's telling you how to shape it.
Can I just add one more thing? It's so interesting listening to the two of you, and I'm sure you've had this experience. You go and you do the research and you fall in love with like all these cool things you're learning about whatever it is, and then you have to write the novel, and you cannot jam in all the cool things that you want to put in I have a friend who says your research is showing. Like, you just wanted to tell me a cool thing that had nothing to do with the story. And I think sometimes that's the hardest part, is picking. I have another historical fiction writer friend who says you use about 3% of what you learn. And it's painful to be like, but I want to tell you all these other cool things. And it's like the story has to come first, and the facts that you learn have to feed the story.
You don't want all the seams to show.
Exactly.
You don't want it to be like, this is where she learned.
Right, yeah.
That is really tricky.
Yeah, go ahead. Any writers or novel in the genre that particularly close or take?
I can just quickly say one that influenced this last book. I mean, it would be a long list, but there's a writer, well, actually two. There's a writer who I actually brought to Boston College last year called Anne Barrest, who's French, and she wrote a book called The Postcard. A couple of you were nodding. Do you know that book? And it interested me partly because it was a Jewish story, and it's a story of the Holocaust, but it interested me also formally because she gave a word to what I was doing, and no one had done that. I hadn't done it. And she said that, or 2 words, she said that what she was writing was she called it a roman vrai, which means a true novel. It's not autofiction, because at least in mine, I'm nowhere in it. But it's based on family history and playing with the lines between the real and the novelistic, but chooses the form of the novel over nonfiction because of things that novels can do around interiority, and also because of gaps in the history where, I'm actually writing a nonfiction book now, and you have to constantly be like, I don't know. Whereas in fiction you can cross. So that book was powerful to me, both because of subject matter overlap, but also because of formally what she was doing. And I have this great job where I can invite pretty much one writer a year, but I got to actually talk to her about it, so that was really fun.
That is such a hard question. I feel like every time I read a book I like, I'm like, ooh, but look how they did this, One book that really has stuck with me is The Exiles by Christina Baker Klein, which is about women who get transported from England to Australia for crimes they may or may not have committed. And the voices in that book are really pretty. And she jumps outside sort of what our standard way of sort of putting together historical fiction. And it's the lives of women who are in many ways forgotten. So that's the one that comes to mind. But I feel like every time I read something good, I'm like, I gotta figure out how to do that. But that's the
Yeah, I mean, I have novels I love. I have crime novels I love. For this series in particular, I think the work of the Vermont writer Howard Frank Mosier was very just like unlocked something for me, a kind of a tone maybe. If you haven't read him, he wrote Where the Rivers Flow North, and I'm spacing the other titles, but he's written many great historical novels about Vermont, and I think one or two contemporaries as well.
Who else has a question? Go ahead, Debbie. I wondered if any of you were willing to talk about your life of working on men. And I know that authors often don't wish to give or can.
So I'm working on a novel. It's contemporary. I have my first book was set in a town called Belém, Massachusetts, which looks weirdly like my own town of Wayland, Mass. And I didn't know if it would ever get published. I was mainly writing it just to please myself. So I basically took my town and rearranged the names and that kind of thing. And so a number of my contemporary fiction novels take sort of it's all set in the same town with different protagonists, but they are connected by a thread of similar secondary characters. And so the new one is about 3 people who have lost their person, and in various ways, and sort of how they show up for each other in this little town, and how it becomes complicated, and that kind of thing.
I'm in sort of for the first time in quite a few years, I don't have a book coming out this year, which is scary in some ways and great in other ways. And so I'm actually working on a couple of projects at the moment. One is the next book in the Bethany, Vermont series, which is set during maple sugaring season. And there's a teenage girl in town who runs away, and Warren is trying to find her, and there's lots of intrigue, and then I'm also working on a standalone thriller that I've sort of been thinking of as my homage to Donna Tartt's The Secret History. It's kind of like a friend group novel, and I can't say too much more about it, but that's been really fun. It's been a fun sort of diversion.
And as I briefly mentioned, I'm actually writing my first nonfiction book. So having excavated my my maternal side, I got very interested in my father's, but I decided to try to write it as nonfiction, both because my father, with whom I was extremely close, died in 2010, but when he was alive and quite ill for the last kind of 8 years of his life, I gave him these little writing prompts, and we had this kind of extraordinary back and forth. He was an English professor, but not a creative writer, but he was very sick, but he would answer these brief prompts. And so I have all this beautiful writing of his. So it's been a chance to kind of be back with him, but also think about writing as communication and healing and things. And then a lot of what I was asking him about had to do partly with his past, and he also had a really interesting childhood. So his father died tragically when my dad was 12, but he was a communist and from the Bronx, and I got his FBI file, and I just got my father's college transcript. This is the sort of craziness that City College, 1954. He turns out he was a really bad student, which really surprised me. He was an English professor at Williams College. He was a very successful man, but he got terrible grades. He got D's in math. He started out as an accountant, so I'm just with all of it, but I'm kind of both in conversation with him and in conversation with what he didn't know or never talked to me about, because there was a lot that he kind of repressed, I think. So, and I'm actually trying to put myself in, which is just terrifying. It's like, ugh. But feels like, why not? Like, you gotta keep. I think we all do this. You're always trying new things, right? Like,
Go ahead.
When you're doing your research and you're interviewing people, are you always recording the conversation?
I am not always. More and more now that we have a phone, but that makes it so easy. I don't always record. If I do record, I also always take notes because I don't trust the technology. I would say now I mostly record, and I do have those old recordings of my grandmother, but I think sometimes it doesn't feel good to be recording. Or like when I would go out with a beekeeper, I wasn't recording. It was more like he had me in a bee suit. I was like opening hives. So some of it literally is practicality, but it also sort of depends what you're looking for. Like for that, I was looking for sensation. I didn't need his words. I needed the experience.
I haven't really recorded people. Often I just feel like that makes people feel a little bit like, oh, am I gonna, if I say something, and also in the 1920s, there's not a lot of people left to interview. So I have read a lot of other people's interviews, although I did find identical twin Harvey girls from the 1950s, and that was very cool. So, yeah.
Yeah, very similar. I find putting a recording device and letting the person know you're recording, which you have to ethically do, it just puts people in a different mindset. And I think I was a reporter before it was convenient to record a lot of conversations, and so I was really good at I had shorthand that I used as a reporter when I would take notes during interviews, and I always found that the way my brain filtered the information I was hearing was, it was like 60% of the work, and that by actually listening to a transcription, it was like the story was less accurate, oddly. that I think that as you listen to something, you figure out what's important. Your brain prioritizes the good stuff. And so I find I sometimes get better results when I don't record. Obviously, there are times when, if you're writing nonfiction, where it's important, and if it's any kind of a situation where someone might take issue with how you've quoted them or how you've used their material, you probably want to have the backup of a recording.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, I think. Oh, go ahead, Mary Jane.
I wanted to ask what
About one fact about Fred Harvey.
Oh, my goodness, where do I begin? One of the things that I think was really interesting about Fred Harvey was that he was such a stickler, and he really wanted people who were not trained, because he felt that they would have bad habits, as you heard. And so he tended to hire from within, because he didn't want people from the outside, which created incredible opportunities for women. Because sometimes he would hire, so the head of personnel, Lucy Steele, who was the one interviewing Charlotte, she started in 1910 as a file clerk and worked her way up. I mean, he was all about merit. She became the head of personnel for the entire company. And Mary Coulter was the architect for the company. And she was a woman who was teaching industrial design in high school, and sort of made her ability known until she became the architect for all his, and I don't think that was because he was such a great feminist. These were the two of the highest ranking women in corporate America of their day, and they were working for the same company. And I don't think he was such a great feminist. I just think he wanted things his way, and if he found somebody he liked, he didn't care, the package they came in. So, see me later for a million more.
I think let's finish there. We're going to have the three of you. Thank you so much.